gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. To get us started off this evening, I want to turn the floor over to Shannon Heron, who has great reading for us this evening. Shannon?
Thank you, Dr. Greene. It is my pleasure to bring to you pieces of literature that I love. As a former elementary school teacher, I spent a good 15 years trying to diversify a classroom library. And even though I've been retired, I still can't pass by some books and not purchase them. So I have several here that I'm going to introduce you to, and then I will be donating them to the Modjeska Simkins School. So maybe when you're in the building at some point, you can see them and look at them. And maybe you will even want to buy one for a teacher to put one in their classroom. The first one is called Stacy's Extraordinary Words. And that name may look familiar, by Stacey Abrams. In this case, it's pretty autobiographical, loves words, and is in a school spelling bee, thinks she's going to win, but unfortunately, there's a little boy there who's a bit of a bully, and he is going to win the spelling bee. And then Stacy learns the art of perseverance, and in learning that words are gifts to lift people. So if you are, I'm wondering if, I wonder now in the current cultural climate, what teacher would perhaps choose not to read this book because there's a political author? So I'm concerned about things like that. This might be a book I have to go fight for one of these days. So Stacy's Extraordinary Words is one that I hope you'll look at. Parker Looks Up, a true life story about 4-year-old Parker. And one more I'll introduce to you as my timer goes off and tells me I only have 2 minutes. The President Sang Amazing Grace, a very beautiful rhyming narrative about what happened in Charleston. So one of these days, I would like to read you all of these books in person, and I hope you'll come to the Grow Building and see them maybe on a special shelf there. Thank you.
Thank you. That's again great. I'm really glad you mentioned those books, because I think one of the things that those books reminds us of is that when we're talking about fighting for a better and more just society, people of all ages are able to learn that story, able to really think about how they can contribute to that effort. So thanks a lot for that, Shannon. I really appreciate that. And I've joked with friends of mine that I wish that some of those books were around when I was a kid, but I digress. So tonight, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Of course, as you might recall, last week at the end of our class, South Carolina was in ruins, thanks to the American Civil War. So tonight, we're going to talk about Reconstruction and the response to Reconstruction in the state, perhaps the most pivotal point in the state's history. Before we get to that, a few housekeeping notes. For one, I know a few folks have asked about the recording of last night's special Sunday session of Modjeska School. Don't forget that those recordings are usually posted to YouTube. They're on the Modjeska Simkins School website and on Facebook as well, like a day or two after the event is over. So make sure to check those whenever you're looking for recordings. Keep in mind that each Modjeska School session is recorded and is posted online the following day or the day afterwards. So those are the places you want to look for those recordings when you wish to watch them. All right. So, and don't forget also, if you have a poem or reading, something that you want to share with the class before we start our next session, please get in touch with Becky Robbins as soon as possible. All right. Again, it could be anything. It could be a poem. It could be a bit of an excerpt from a speech or a book, whatever you wish to share with us, a song. Again, part of what makes the Modjeska School such a great school is the participation from you, the students. Remember that you're not just learning from me, but we are all learning from each other. And a part of that is, of course, getting together in fellowship via song, music, poetry, and so forth. All right, so I actually want to start tonight's session by sharing a couple of images with you. So give me a second to pull this up. And I do apologize. I've been having some jump drive issues all day today, so having to kind of restart that. But I actually want to start class off by showing you an image from my office at Claflin University. And this is actually, I think, weirdly appropriate for a variety of reasons. Number one, of course, because Claflin itself was founded in 1869 at the height of Reconstruction in South Carolina. But also the image itself, I think, might be familiar to at least a few of you. So let me see if I can find this very quickly. Now, the thing about the Reconstruction era in South Carolina is that in many ways, it's really the most important story of Reconstruction in this time period. And by the way, Dan, if you don't mind, could you give me some screen sharing privileges just for a hot second?
Mr. Bursey will have to do as much because he has the power this evening.
Okay.
Brett, if you would.
I will. I was unaware that I had the power tonight. Dr. Greene, the power is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'm going to refrain from any He-Man, the Masters of the Universe jokes, but I digress. All right. So here we go. So I want to show you guys an image from my office at Claflin. This is actually on my wall. And I know a few who recognize one of the framed pictures here. But this is what I have on my wall at Claflin. Of course, I have the photograph of Justice Simkins that was graciously given to me several years ago after my first Modjeska school session was finished in 2019. And right next to it, I have a rather famous painting that was seen in many African-American homes during the Reconstruction period. Social Security. This particular painting actually portrays, as you can see in the title, the first colored senator and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. Now, several of these gentlemen in the painting were actually representatives from South Carolina. And I think when many Americans think of the Reconstruction era, sooner or later, they have to at least give brief consideration to the state of South Carolina. Now, yesterday, Vernon Burton and Armin and the two presenters yesterday, they talked a bit about how civil rights was affected by the Supreme Court and vice versa. But one thing that Dr. Burton pointed out was that South Carolina so often is glossed over in the broader historiography of the United States, of the American South, of African Americans, and so forth. Ironically enough, though, Reconstruction is probably the one era in U.S. history where you really cannot skip over South Carolina. You have to talk about the state if you're going to give not only a fuller interpretation of Reconstruction, but also if you're going to talk about what Reconstruction probably should have been all across the South. So this evening, I want to talk a bit about how Reconstruction in the Palmetto State was both similar to other Reconstructions across the South, but also how it was very different. And the biggest reason for that difference is, of course, because the state of South Carolina had a majority Black population. We have to keep that in mind as we discuss South Carolina. Now, this was actually the photograph I was trying to find last week, but this is a photograph of some of the ruins in Charleston, South Carolina in the summer of 1865. As you look at this image, as much as you might want to focus on what's in the background, the destroyed buildings, the damaged column, etc., pay particularly close attention to the young men who are in the center of the photograph. These are boys who were likely born into slavery in and around the Charleston area, either right before or during the Civil War. And suddenly, like their parents, their grandparents, their brothers, their sisters, their relatives, they find themselves in a drastically different world than the one they were born into. South Carolina in 1865 was a place that was really a flashpoint in American and I would dare say world history. A period where there were many different possibilities in the air of where the state and the nation could go next.
All right, Annie, thank you so much for holding. I have Aaron on the line with us.
And I think really
and he'll go over everything you need to.
In the 1860s and the end of the Civil War, the great concern across the nation was we fought this war for 4 long, bloody years. How do we bring the nation back together? Certainly, the white South wanted to do it on its own terms. So after the Civil War was over, you immediately see all across the South laws being passed that were designed to really shape and mold how Black people lived in their various states. They were called Black Codes. And in South Carolina in particular, these Black Codes took on a particularly pernicious outlook on Black life. In essence, the Black Codes were designed to keep Black people as close to slavery as possible. And I want to share just 2 of those laws from South Carolina's Black Codes that were first put into law in December of 1865. So this is Section 35. All persons of color who make contracts for service or labor shall be known as servants, and those with whom they contract shall be known as masters. I think it's pretty obvious to see what they're trying to do with this. This is not just, of course, about race in South Carolina, but it's also linked very much to labor in South Carolina. And again, those 2 ideas of race and labor are thoroughly intertwined in the history of the South, and especially in South Carolina. But what's especially ironic about this is that this is the same month where the 13th Amendment of the Constitution banning slavery also is formally ratified and goes into effect in the U.S. Constitution. And so the Southern states are well aware of this. And what they're trying to do is to find a way around the 13th Amendment as quickly and as fast as possible. Another part of the Black Codes, this is Section 45, and I don't want to spend too much time on this right now, but one thing that you see here is that they lay out very intricately what the so-called servants can actually do. And in particular, if you look at the very bottom of this, it says the servant shall be careful of all the animals and property of his master, and especially of the animals and implements used by him, shall protect the same from injury by other persons, and shall be answerable for all property lost, destroyed, or injured by his negligence, dishonesty, or bad faith. And so clearly what you see here is that the laws being promulgated by the South Carolina legislature in the winter of 1865 are designed to keep Black Americans in as close to a point of servitude as possible. Now, putting this in context on a national level is also important. When the Civil War comes to an end in April and May of 1865, the federal government under President Andrew Johnson, remember, President Lincoln assassinated in April of 1865, his Vice President Andrew Johnson of Tennessee takes over shortly afterward. They're trying to bring the Southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. One of the great what ifs of American history is what if Abraham Lincoln had actually lived into Reconstruction? What would he have done? As Dr. Burton pointed out yesterday, Abraham Lincoln, throughout the course of his life, just as a human being, but as a politician as well, showed an ability to change and grow whenever he learned something new. Now, President Lincoln, before he was killed, on the one hand, was talking about trying to bring the Southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. On the other hand, it is worth noting that Abraham Lincoln's last public address, given about a day or 2 before he was killed from the steps of the White House, he talks about, for the first time in American history, granting Black men the right to vote. He was the first U.S. president to state on the record he was in favor of giving Black men the right to vote, albeit only to what he called the very intelligent, and also to soldiers who had fought in the Civil War. But it was a lot more than any U.S. president had said before, and many historians believe that's actually why John Wilkes Booth killed President Lincoln. It was because he was beginning to promise suffrage rights to Black men. But President Johnson wants to bring the Southern states back into the Union as quickly as possible. And so the Southern states, with, again, much of the South still in ruins, holds congressional elections in the fall of 1865. And they're sending congressmen back to Washington, D.C. by December of that year. Among others were former Confederate generals, soldiers who served in the Confederate Army, even members of the Confederate cabinet, including the former vice president of the Confederacy, Georgia's own Alexander Stephens. Now, suffice to say, Republicans see people they were quite literally fighting against a few months ago returning to Congress. They aren't terribly happy about that. To add insult to injury, the Black codes across the South also infuriate many Republicans who see them as a direct attempt to circumvent the 13th Amendment. The mid to late 1860s really becomes an era of American history where much of the nation's politics is defined by the issue of racism in American life. This poster you see before you now is actually from the 1864 election. It says here the two platforms. The Democratic platform is for the white man. The Republican platform is for the Negro. You would see placards and platform posters like this in 1864 and again in 1868, as the Democratic Party tried to make it clear that it truly was a white man's party. However, many Republicans continue to hold on to the belief of the Civil War being a war that was justified to destroy slavery and to restore the Union. And in 1866 and 1867, you see the Republican Party beginning to rebel in Congress against President Andrew Johnson and Johnson's softer take on Reconstruction. Now, it is also worth noting on a national level that when Andrew Johnson became president, many Black leaders like Frederick Douglass thought, okay, he'll be a friend to the Negro. The reasoning is actually really important here. For those who don't know, Andrew Johnson was the only Southern politician to stay in Congress during the Civil War. He was actually from East Tennessee. Andrew Johnson grew up poor. He was seen as a champion of poor whites in Tennessee and across the South. And he often clashed with slave owners over questions of slavery, over questions of citizenship, and so forth. And so when Andrew Johnson becomes president, many Americans assume, okay, he'll just continue President Lincoln's policies. He'll be a friend to Negroes. He's never really liked slave owners. He's the right person for the job. Not so fast, my friend. Instead, President Johnson makes it very clear to Frederick Douglass and anyone else listening that while he was opposed to slave owners, it wasn't because of any love for Black people. It was because he believed in a version of white supremacy that especially privileged poor whites, the white working class, but at the expense of their Black counterparts. Now, on a national level, this fight between Andrew Johnson on the one hand and the Republican Congress on the other leads to Congress really asserting its authority over Johnson. In 1866, Congress passes the first Civil Rights Act in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was designed to override the various state Black codes. President Johnson vetoes it, and his veto is quickly overridden by Congress. At that same time, riots in New Orleans and Memphis in the summer of 1866 further spur Republican action against both the Black codes in the South and President Johnson in Washington, D.C. And by 1867, Congress has passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which basically says that Southern states, in order to re-enter the Union, are going to have to write brand new state constitutions that get rid of the Black codes and also grant Black men the right to vote. And also, those Southern states are going to have to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to regain admission to the Union. And if you're wondering about the colors on the map here, these represent various military districts. So Virginia was Military District 1, the Carolinas were District 2, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama were District 3, Mississippi and Arkansas, District 4, and Texas and Louisiana were District 5. Within each district, you had U.S. troops who were posted to aid with a variety of things, helping Black men to vote, protecting property rights, so on and so forth. Each district had its own unique characteristics. It's worth noting that General Philip Sheridan, who was a Civil War hero and in command of District 5, Texas and Louisiana, referred to his district as basically a special place in hell. But each district had its own unique set of challenges. But as you can see on the map, each state would eventually re-enter the Union, which brings us to South Carolina. And you take a look at the map. It tells you that the state of South Carolina re-enters the Union June 25th, 1868. This is after, of course, the state government begins deliberations on a new radical state constitution. Now, this is probably an image some of you have seen before, but if you haven't, I think it bears taking a look at for just a second. Of course, it's labeled radical members of the South Carolina Legislature, and these are just the men who were part of the first post-constitutional convention state government in 1868, 1869. And as you can see, a majority of the men in this image are Black. Now, after the Reconstruction era came to an end, there was a stereotype across the country that most of the Southern state legislatures were majority Black. It was Black Republican rule all across the South, so on and so forth. That wasn't really true. In fact, what was true was that South Carolina was the only state that had a majority Black legislature, and that was the state House. The state Senate was just barely majority white. Now, before I go on, I do want to point out one thing I forgot to mention, and I'm glad it was mentioned in the chat. Tennessee. So you notice Tennessee is not in any of the districts. That's because Tennessee was able to rejoin the Union in 1866. Make a very long story short, Reconstruction in Tennessee actually began during the war. The eastern portion of Tennessee, roughly like a third of the state, was under federal control for most of the war. And President Lincoln and the state government thought of Tennessee as not really having formally seceded because part of the state was under federal control. In fact, Andrew Johnson is briefly military governor of Tennessee during the war. So by the time the Civil War settled down, Tennessee can re-enter the Union rather quickly. Of course, South Carolina doesn't have that luxury. South Carolina being seen as the very bulwark of ideas of slavery, of states' rights, of white supremacy, of secessionism, nullification, you name it, South Carolina was home to it if you thought it was something that was bad. But the state constitutional convention took a long, hard look at where the state was at in 1868 and said, this is our best chance to make something different of the state of South Carolina. Now, if you don't mind, you beg my pardon, I'm going to read just a paragraph from perhaps the most famous, most important work on Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. Now, in his book, which is basically the size of a brick, he has a whole chapter in South Carolina. This is what he said about the state constitution. Quote, the Constitution was written in good English and was an excellent document, embodying some of the best legal principles of the age. In letter, it was as good as any other constitution the state has ever had, or as most American states had at that time. This assertion is supported by the practical endorsement which a subsequent generation of South Carolinians gave it. The conservative whites were content to live under it for 18 years after they recovered control of the state government. And when in 1895 they meant to make a new constitution, the document they produced had many of the features of the Constitution of 1868. He goes on to write, it was not, of course, an original document, either in form or wording, but copied largely from northern state models. But colored men discussed it, amended it, and voted for its adoption. They shared in the capacity and thought that made it, end quote. Now, when Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction in 1935, remember he's writing in an America that is not only struggling with the Great Depression, but is also struggling with the depths of lynching, white supremacy throughout the country. And Du Bois is trying to make clear that Black people actually can also be a successful part of a successful government. He points to the Constitution of South Carolina as a good example of this. So what was so great about this Constitution? What would this Constitution actually do for the average South Carolinian? Well, amongst other things, it provides for the first time in the state's history funding for public education. Up until this point, South Carolina's public school system barely existed. The state's elite often sent their children either to private schools in the state or brought in private tutors or sent their kids elsewhere in the country to get an education. Most poor South Carolinians barely received an education at all, and many of the Black delegates to the state convention in 1868 were determined to make sure that the state government offered funding for a decent quality education. Also, for the first time in the state's history, Black men are now allowed to vote. This was, of course, one of the requirements to re-enter the Union. Debtors' prisons were abolished by the state constitution. Again, this was a radical departure from what the state had done in the past. And divorce was also legalized too. Now, again, what you're seeing here with the state constitution of 1868 is that they're not just dealing with issues of race, but also issues of class and gender in a way that no one had ever seen the state up until that point. But it is worth noting that there were some things that the state constitutional convention didn't quite solve, but it's worth considering that they actually had these debates in the first place. Now, in American history, when we normally teach American history, this is either here or maybe a week ago, we started talking about women fighting for the right to vote. Of course, the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first time in U.S. history women formally publicly demanded the right to vote, was held in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. By the 1860s, the fight over women's suffrage is starting to gain some momentum. Now, not enough to guarantee women the right to vote at this moment in history. We'll get to that in a second. But even in South Carolina, you're seeing folks like William J. Whipper, who's at the convention. He is a Black delegate. He is a lawyer. And he, at the convention, is presenting some of the most radical amendments to this new Constitution. He pushes for public education, for example. He is very much determined to get Black men the right to vote. But he also calls for women's suffrage. He's one of the few people at the convention to talk about this issue formally. Now, the convention is pretty radical, but it's not quite that radical. And unfortunately, Whipper's call for women's suffrage doesn't quite get far enough. But it does show just how, dare I say, revolutionary the convention felt in 1868, that South Carolina is going from barely giving men the right to vote before the Civil War to not only granting suffrage to Black men, but even openly talking about granting the suffrage to women as well. Now, I think it's worth noting a part of why Whipper is so willing to discuss suffrage for women is that he's also married to Frances Ann Rollins, who is part of the Rollins Sisters. Some of us have heard of before. They're an important Black political family in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, the Rollins Sisters, they become known across the country because they host a political salon in Charleston. It's the place where the elite of South Carolina go to, whether Black or white. They host parties. They have various events there. And the Rollins Sisters become politically important within the state. There were five of them: Charlotte, Frances, Catherine, Marie Louise, and Florence. And what's really interesting about the Rollins Sisters is that they not only host this salon, but they become politically active in their own way. Now, I always say this to my students at Claflin, and I think it's worth repeating here. When you're looking at the history of American politics, you don't just want to think of political power as simply being in the ballot. Voting rights are, of course, crucial, but politics also includes everything you do before you vote and also everything you do after you vote. And these sisters are a great example of that. They didn't have the right to vote, but they were politically active. They gave their support to various Black delegates to the convention and to the state legislature. And also by 1870, they actually found a chapter of the American Women's Suffrage Association right here in South Carolina, where they continued to press for the right to vote. And in fact, I believe France has actually become, Charlotte, they've become pretty active in the national version of that organization too. But the Rollins Sisters, I think, represent both what Reconstruction was in South Carolina and what Reconstruction could have been. Because as women, they did not have the right to vote, but they showed time and time and time again how women in South Carolina had politically astute minds. They certainly, in more recent eras of American history, could have run for office, could have held positions of authority and power. But during Reconstruction, they were incredibly critical to holding together the Black and white coalition that made up the South Carolina Republican Party through their salons, through their other events, through their political rallies, and so forth. I also mention this because there is a great documentary out made by ETV about the Rollins Sisters and the suffrage movement. I think if you actually go to ETV's website, you can actually watch it there. But it's a fantastic documentary. It's a great one. It's worth checking out. You also have other examples of how Black political power is being exercised in South Carolina. You have, for example, Jonathan Jasper Wright, who was the first Black state Supreme Court justice in South Carolina. Again, this is something that would have been unimaginable as late as 1865, 1866, 1867. Now having Black men, not just in the state legislature, but in the state judicial system as well. You're seeing Black men and women assert their authority and their power in ways that were just beyond the imagination of most South Carolinians before or even during the Civil War. And it's worth noting that after the new state constitution is put into effect, even the flagship University of South Carolina is undergoing a dramatic change as well. From 1873 until 1877, the University of South Carolina is briefly desegregated. Yes, this is 90 years before the 1963 desegregation of South Carolina. The school already had a prior history of that desegregation during the Reconstruction period. At that time, the school included both students and faculty of color, including the man you see here, Richard T. Greener, to whom a statue was built at USC a few years ago. Now, what makes this especially interesting is that although various white students withdrew from the university and refused to come back because of this desegregation campaign, the school does keep some white students. It does add Black students. By 1875 or so, in fact, the school is majority Black in terms of student body. And if you are to visit the campus of South Carolina today, what is especially noteworthy is how this moment in history is barely remarked upon on campus. If you walk to USC's campus, let's say you go to the library, there is a marker there describing the school's history. It says it was South Carolina College from this year to this year. It was University of South Carolina. And then if you look at the marker, it stops at 1877 and it resumes at 1880. Why? Because thanks to redemption, we'll get to in a second, the school was actually closed for 3 years because white South Carolinians were so angered that the state university allowed Black students and faculty. We'll talk some more about that in a moment. Also, I apologize, I have to do a shameless plug, but if you do want to learn more about this, the book I quoted with Tyler D. Perry called Invisible No More actually has several chapters about Reconstruction at South Carolina. It is a very fascinating period in the school's history, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about that during the Q&A as well. But I think the most fascinating part of Reconstruction in South Carolina was the Land Commission. I'm sure most of you have heard the expression 40 acres and a mule. The colloquial term for the Black desire for land ownership in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Now, that idea of 40 acres and a mule, like everything else, has a history. That history starts in 1865 with General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15, which originally granted roughly 40 acres of land to each Black family in and around the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina in 1865. However, that order was rescinded by President Johnson, who wanted the land given back to the former plantation owners. So members of the Freedmen's Bureau, which were in charge of assisting Black people getting back on their feet after the Civil War, those officers waited until the absolute last moment until they were practically forced to take the land back from Blacks in Carolina and Georgia. The aftermath of this, you have men at the convention in South Carolina saying, how can we get land to people in this state? In 1868, they actually sent a message to Congress asking for about $1 million or so to purchase land in South Carolina. Congress turns them down, and they say, we're not going to get involved with that. So instead, the state government here, quickly after the state constitution is ratified, forms the South Carolina Land Commission. In essence, it was a government agency that leased land to anyone, Black or white, who was willing to work off that lease for several years. And virtually overnight, you see Black land ownership explode throughout the state of South Carolina. Now, it's worth noting that no other Southern state tried anything like the Land Commission. And the Land Commission itself will last until roughly 1890, when it, like numerous other Reconstruction era programs, is killed by the Democratic legislature in South Carolina. However, the Land Commission, even though many of the people who purchased land under it lose that land, thanks to things like the Panic of 1873, crop failures in the early 1870s, and so forth, there are still some Black families, especially in Lower Richland, which still reside on the land their ancestors purchased during the 1860s and 70s. In particular, if anyone has gone to the Harriet Barber House in Lower Richland, that particular house, which is a historic site, is actually on land purchased by Samuel and Harriet Barber in the 1870s, thanks to the Land Commission. Now, many Black Americans in the state government were concerned about land ownership because they understood that in the 19th century context, especially, land ownership meant both economic independence and political independence. And they were concerned with assuring both of those for Black South Carolinians for generations to come. Now, Francis Cardozo, who would serve in the 1870s as South Carolina Secretary of State, takes over the program and tries to make it as free from graft and corruption as possible, trying to prove that this kind of program was actually worth implementing in the first place. Now, before I go on, just one quick point of fact. Going back to yesterday's conversation, it was pointed out by Dr. Burton that a lot of historians tend to ignore South Carolina. And I can assure you from personal experience, this is definitely the case with the Land Commission. In 2018, the University of South Carolina and City of Columbia hosted the Urban History Association Conference. It was the first big history conference we'd had in Columbia in a long time. And I actually gave a tour to historians from across the country of Lower Richland. And these are prominent historians, some of whom you may have read before, folks who've written about urban decay, race and city life in America, so on and so forth. Really some heavy hitters in American history. And yet virtually none of them had heard of the Land Commission. It's just one of those things in US history and South Carolina history that is just glossed over. Yet it's an example of a government essentially redistributing the wealth, because the land that they sold to residents was land purchased from plantation owners who were desperate to get some sort of profit off the land they had during the Civil War and afterwards. And so this land was originally owned by plantation owners, sold to the government, then sold back to citizens of South Carolina in the 1870s and 1880s. Of course, as we all know, the Reconstruction era was not without its opponents, especially in the Deep South. In 1866, the Ku Klux Klan is formed in Tennessee and very quickly becomes a prominent anti-Black and anti-Republican organization all throughout the South during the Reconstruction period. Now, in 1895, Robert Smalls would argue during that year's Constitutional Convention that upwards of 53,000 Black Americans were killed during and after the Reconstruction period, mainly by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Leagues, and the Red Shirts, who we'll talk about in a moment. But KKK activity was so widespread throughout South Carolina in particular that President Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Civil War, now turned president of the US, pressures Congress to pass the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 that would give the president the power to use the US Army and federal marshals to hunt down Klan members across the South. Now, what ends up happening after the Klan Act is passed in 1871, President Grant makes one last appeal to Klansmen, specifically in South Carolina. He says, if you lay down your arms, you turn in your hoods, we can forget about all of this. No reply. So in response, President Grant suspends habeas corpus in 9 counties in South Carolina in 1871. To give you a sense of the scale of this attempt to clamp down on Klan activity, in York County alone, this is just some numbers, 195 folks are taken into custody. About 500 just turn themselves in. And roughly 200 flee York County, flee the state, and eventually make it to Canada. Some of them make it to Canada. Now, the reason habeas corpus is suspended, by the way, is that it empowers President Grant to essentially have as many folks arrested without having to present a ton of evidence or without having to try them one by one, try them as groups of people. Now, I will say, in terms of sources identify KKK members, it's kind of difficult to say. I will say some of the congressional records that were produced by the 1871 and 72 hearings on the Klan produce a voluminous record of who they think might have been in the Klan. Some of this, quite frankly, we just may never know because some of these folks had so much support in counties in South Carolina, their identities were hidden for years and decades afterward. But the best place to look for sources of names and such would be the actual congressional testimonies given by Black residents and Republican Party officials from South Carolina to the federal government in 1871, where they were trying to get more support for fighting the Klan. In the early 1870s, Congress holds a series of hearings on Klan activity in the South, seeing it as a major threat to not just Reconstruction, but really to the unification of the country itself. In some places, especially in South Carolina, it seemed as though the Civil War itself had not really come to a full conclusion. It was instead being fought by other means. Oh, and by the way, look at this cartoon for a second. Of course, I think some of the symbolism is fairly obvious. You have a donkey with a KKK on it, showing that the KKK was seen by many as the paramilitary wing of the Southern Democratic Party. But then you also look at the folks being hung from that tree. One of them's holding a bag that says Ohio. This is, of course, the classic symbol of the so-called carpetbagger, the people who moved from the north to the south during the Reconstruction period to make some money, to get involved in politics. Some of them were coming down south for reasons of helping the region. Others came down south to make a quick buck. But you want to keep in mind that terms like carpetbagger or scalawag, which was used for Southerners who supported Reconstruction, these are terms that were coined by white Southerners themselves. So just be aware of that if you think about these terms. But despite the efforts undertaken to fight the Klan in the 1870s, even going so far as President Grant forming the Department of Justice in 1870, specifically to fight the Klan and other paramilitary groups across the South, there was also some reason for optimism when it came to the Reconstruction era. Again, this was the image I showed at the beginning of tonight's class of the first Black men in Congress in 1870-71. But imagine for a moment if you were in, say, South Carolina in 1871. You were in Orangeburg County or Richland County or in Georgetown County or elsewhere, and you went to a Black home. There's a very good chance you would have seen this image in many homes across South Carolina, which many Black South Carolinians would have held with pride, this image in their homes or other images like it. History has a weird way of radically changing over time in a very short amount of time. If you had told someone in South Carolina, whether Black or white, enslaved or free, in, say, January 1865, that, oh, by January 1871, not only will Black men have the right to vote, but they'll also have Black men in Congress, they probably would not have believed you, even in 1865. And yet, only a few short years later, you have Black political power changing the South radically throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Now, yesterday, our two guest speakers talked a bit about the various Reconstruction amendments added to the Constitution. And I want to discuss those very briefly because they're an important part of tonight's story as well. As you might recall from your civics lessons or history lessons in K-12 or college, after the Civil War comes to an end, 3 new amendments are added to the Constitution. 13th banning slavery, the 14th defining for the first time national citizenship, and the 15th granting Black men the right to vote. Now, these 3 Reconstruction amendments fundamentally alter the nation's relationship to the Constitution and the people's relationship to their government. Again, up until that point, up until the 1860s, there had not been, for example, a national definition of citizenship. It instead kind of varied by state. There were some national treaties that gave a anomalous term for citizenship, but the 14th Amendment formally defines what citizenship is. The 15th, of course, grants Black men the right to vote. And it's especially noteworthy because in the late 1860s, several northern states, like New York, Ohio, Illinois, and others, would hold statewide referendum on granting Black men the right to vote. And in many of those referendums, they actually failed. And so the Republican Party decides, let's make this a national constitutional issue. And they eventually push for passage of the 15th Amendment. Now, keep in mind, in the South, because of the Reconstruction Act, many of those states had already granted Black men the right to vote. But many northern states were at first reluctant to do the same thing until pushed by the fight for the 15th Amendment. Now, in addition to all of that, in addition to the KKK Act and so forth, President Grant also pushes for other civil rights acts, including the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Now, this one is debated in 1874 and 1875, and it comes at a time when Reconstruction is under attack all across the American South. In places like Mississippi and Virginia, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas, Reconstruction is not either already over or it's on its last leg, certainly in retreat. And even in South Carolina, a place that was seen as the bastion of radical Reconstruction, a truly radical Reconstruction, folks on the ground were starting to feel the ground shifting under their feet. But in Congress, Republicans decide to push for one last Civil Rights Act, an act that was designed to ban discrimination, public accommodations, restaurants, places like that, railroad cars, etc. Now, among those who fights for the 1875 Civil Rights Act is Robert Ellington, who was a Black congressman from the state of South Carolina. And one of the most famous moments in the history of the House of Representatives occurs during this debate, Robert Elliott, Republican, finds himself debating with our good friend, Alexander Stephens, a Democrat from Georgia. Now, I mentioned before, Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. And as a native Georgian, I have to say, Stephens just annoys me to no end. I say that as a historian and as a native Georgian. But I digress. On the floor of the House, Elliott gives arguably one of the most passionate speeches about civil rights in American political history. And I want to just read to you part of that speech. So listen very carefully. And again, this is a Black man arguing this in 1874, not only at the tail end of Reconstruction, but 90 years before the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In a way, Elliott was speaking not just to his contemporaries, but he still speaks to us today through these words. And I quote, "The passage of this bill will determine the civil status, not only of the Negro, but of any other class of citizens who may feel themselves discriminated against. It will form the capstone of that temple of liberty begun on this continent under discouraging circumstances, carried on in spite of the sneers of monarchists and the cavils of pretended friends of freedom, until at last it stands in all its beautiful symmetry and proportions, a building, the grandest which the world has ever seen, realizing the most sanguine expectations and the highest hopes of those who, in the name of equal, impartial, and universal liberty, laid the foundation stones." End quote. Now, after he gave that speech, Congressman Elliott received a rousing round of applause from those in the House chamber. The act was passed on March the 1st, 1875. Unfortunately, Elliott himself would be thrown out of Congress after 1877, and he actually died in poverty in 1884 at the age of 41. Elliott's story, I think, symbolizes what happens to Reconstruction in South Carolina. Now, I mentioned a moment ago how in 1874, people across the South were beginning to feel Reconstruction change dramatically. This is for a multitude of reasons. Arguably, the biggest reason is the panic of 1873, in the previous year, where the nation's economy, after years of economic growth after the Civil War, suffers what is basically a severe depression, where the nation's stock market collapses, the nation's economy collapses, and virtually overnight, many white Northerners are more concerned with their own pocketbooks and job status than they are with Reconstruction. Also in 1874, you're seeing in states like Mississippi, a new plan being hatched of how to resist and overthrow Reconstruction government. I'll get to that in a moment. And in South Carolina itself, even though the Republican Party is still a majority in the state house and state legislature, the Republican Party is also bitterly split between two sides, the regular radical Republican Party and the so-called reformist faction led by Daniel Chamberlain. Now, Chamberlain was a Northerner who moved to South Carolina after the Civil War, and he receives popular support because he promises to root out corruption and graft in the state government. Now, it is noteworthy that corruption was a problem in South Carolina, but it was a problem everywhere during this time period, not just in the Palmetto State. Still, Chamberlain and others, he received some support from Black Americans, but others were a bit nervous about Chamberlain. They weren't quite sure if he could really be trusted. Now, I want to once again read another passage from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction about Chamberlain. And I think Du Bois eloquently states why Black South Carolinians didn't quite trust Chamberlain. Quote, "Here was a chance for white Carolina to unite with the progressive Northerners and Negroes and usher in honest and efficient government without disturbing the right of Black men to vote and the right of labor to strive for universal suffrage for its interests. When some Negro leaders refused to follow Chamberlain, this was from no opposition to reform, It was because they saw Chamberlain surrendering in many respects to those white elements in the state who were pledged to degrade Negroes and who were using reform as a stepping stone and an excuse for disenfranchisement. It was a cruel dilemma, but their fears and suspicions proved true. So Chamberlain becomes governor in 1874. The forces of progressivism and reform in the state are divided. And pretty soon, as other Southern states begin to collapse to redemption and away from Reconstruction, even South Carolina itself is not immune to these challenges. Now, nationally, in 1874, Democrats, for the first time in a generation, or at least since the Civil War, win a majority of seats in Congress because of the 1873 financial collapse, because of exhaustion, Reconstruction, and so forth. In the South, many Southern states had already dissolved their Reconstruction era governments. In South Carolina, the Republican Party is desperately holding on for dear life. Now, this cartoon you see is about what was called the Hamburg Riot in July of 1876, where 5 African American members of the state militia were murdered by white South Carolinians, many of whom were supporters of Democratic nominee for governor, Wade Hampton III. Now, to briefly explain what happens during the so-called Hamburg Riot, really the Hamburg Massacre, it's important to note the relationship of both Black and white South Carolinians to their state government. Now, going back to the 1860s for a second, especially after 1868, many white South Carolinians actively boycott the state government. They simply do not participate in it. They see it as being illegitimate, as not being for them, as just being puppets of the Republican Party, and so they refuse to participate. But by the 1870s, the state Democratic Party is starting to encourage more of them to get involved as voters, as candidates for office, and as people who can intimidate Black and white Republican voters from going to the polls. Now, in Hamburg, you have a Black militia because by 1876, the state militia, which was run by the Republican Party, was virtually all Black. Those were the only soldiers they could get throughout most of the state. And they were on maneuvers in Hamburg, basically doing a march in the town, and they were told by white citizens of Hamburg to get out of the street, to move. Eventually they did, but not before basically telling the white people in Hamburg it couldn't just simply be ordered around and bullied around. This was taken as a provocation by the white citizens of the area. They eventually grabbed arms and munitions from Augusta, Georgia, nearby, and other parts of the central Savannah River area. And they returned to Hamburg and essentially forced the militia to surrender. And in the middle of the night, they actually murdered 5 of the militiamen. Now, members of the mob that attacked the militia were caught and eventually arrested. But after redemption in 1877, all those people were basically let go scot-free. Now, the Hamburg Riot earns national attention, and as you can see from this cartoon, earns condemnation in Harper's Weekly and elsewhere. But the political will to do something about it greatly waned since 1871, since the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan Act. Instead, when the Hamburg Riot happens, many Americans, even those sympathetic to the Negro, were saying, that's just too bad, and really moving along. Now, this happens against the backdrop of the election of 1876, both a national presidential election and a state gubernatorial election. Now, in South Carolina, the candidates were Wade Hampton III for the Democratic Party, a Confederate veteran of the Civil War, against Daniel Chamberlain, a man who was already governor and incumbent, who was desperately trying to hold his party together. Now, this is the election where you see the rise of the so-called red shirts. Men wearing red shirts, campaigning for Hampton throughout the state, promising to redeem South Carolina from Republican rule. Now, this term redemption, I think some of you have probably heard before. It's a term that was coined by Southern Democrats in the 1870s to gin up votes, gin up support across the South for white Southerners, to say that we're going to redeem our states from Republican, what they called misrule. Now, keep in mind, this was after in some places a decade, in some places, most places less time than that, of Republican rule across the South, where you have a combination of Black men and also white Southerners and white Northerners coming together to govern these places. And again, I think it's worth noting that there were some white Southerners who actually actively backed the Reconstruction policies of President Grant and others. And I ended up pointing it out because I think we have this perception of the Reconstruction era as one of just Black men versus white Democrats in the South. But in fact, it was a little bit more complicated than that. I'll give you one quick example from Louisiana. James Longstreet, who was the Confederate general during the Civil War, one of Robert E. Lee's right-hand men, during Reconstruction, James Longstreet comes to support President Grant. He actually becomes friends with Grant. He actually supports Republican Party policy. And James Longstreet tells other white Southerners that, it's really about time that we move on from the old South, that we form a new South instead. Longstreet actually goes so far as to, in his last act as a military commander, lead Black militia in Louisiana against the White League in New Orleans in 1874, in what was essentially a pitched battle on the streets of New Orleans called the Battle of Liberty Place. Now, Longstreet and his men were defeated in battle by this White League militia, but it shows again how there were some parts of the white South that were also determined to change things for the better, right? So I want to make it clear that there were some other alternatives to how Reconstruction had turned out, but throughout most of the white South, there was a reluctance to support anything that smacked of so-called quote-unquote Negro rule. And Wade Hampton III tapped into that in South Carolina. Now, when he runs for governor in 1876, the red shirts use fear and intimidation tactics throughout the state to dissuade Black Americans from voting at the polls. In some places, you see outright vote stuffing at the ballot box, where there are some ballots that are returned, or ballot boxes that are returned, where there are votes that outnumber the number of people who actually live in that district, weirdly enough. Despite these tactics, despite the voter intimidation, despite the fall of the polls, when the election results come back in November 1876, it's unclear who actually won. Chamberlain claims he's won. Hampton claims he has won. And this debate really, it mirrors the national debate about who won in 1876, because two candidates for president, Samuel Tilden of the Democratic Party, Rutherford B. Hayes of the Republican Party, they also have a dispute over who's won the election, things to dispute electoral votes from places like South Carolina. Now, in March of 1877, of course, many Americans have heard the story of how Reconstruction in the South comes to an end because Republicans and Democrats make a deal on a national level. Democrats basically say, if you pull federal troops out of the South, like South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, we will then allow Rutherford B. Hayes to win. That leads, of course, to South Carolina's election being decided in favor of Wade Hampton. The state Supreme Court rules in favor of Hampton. Governor Chamberlain steps down, and Reconstruction, for all intents and purposes in South Carolina, is essentially over, sort of. It is worth noting that even though Reconstruction comes to an end in South Carolina, the legacy of Reconstruction doesn't go away for quite a while. For example, let's think about Robert Smalls, the Civil War hero. Now, of course, most South Carolinians know that he served in Congress at some point. But what's worth noting is that he actually serves in Congress the bulk of his terms are actually after Reconstruction comes to an end. On the other hand, his service in Congress shows how the Low Country was still a bastion of Black political power, even during the Reconstruction age coming to an end. Now, of course, despite this, in the 1880s, it is difficult for folks like Smalls to hold on to political power in South Carolina and elsewhere. And I think it's worth considering, too, what could have been during the Reconstruction era. Of course, we spend a lot of time talking about Robert Smalls and other heroes of the Reconstruction period. But if you rewind back to 1865, there were some who thought, like Frederick Douglass, that there was an option for shared political power in the South between Black and white working class people. This is, again, why some folks thought Johnson was the perfect choice for that era, because before and during the Civil War, he was seen as a friend of white working class people across the country. But Johnson makes the choice to go with white supremacy as opposed to a shared multiracial vision of American society. This is all to say that if you think about that option being taken, a genuinely multiracial Reconstruction, one that had broad-based support instead of what we got, it's very easy to think of Reconstruction perhaps lasting a bit longer in the South, or at the very least turning out a bit different. Again, there were several different roads not taken in the 1860s and 1870s, which is why during, for instance, the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s, many Black activists referred to their movement as the Second Reconstruction, hoping to finish the job of the first, and why activists today refer to this as being the Third Reconstruction. I think the lesson here is that perhaps Reconstruction never actually ended. It simply changed form. Okay, I want to very quickly wrap things up here because we've, of course, got to talk about our good friend Ben Tillman. But I want to put Tillman and the Constitution of 1895 into proper context as well. Keep in mind that in the aftermath of Reconstruction, across the South, there are some new political questions being raised. Namely, these questions about what is politics going to look like with the Black vote being suppressed. I think there's an assumption that after Reconstruction comes to an end, the white South is firmly unified. On the contrary, the white South in the 1870s and 1880s and going into the 1890s is very much divided over issues of class, issues of wealth inequality, and especially over issues of land ownership. By the 1880s and 1890s, you have the formation of the populist movement, especially across the South and the West, where farmers who are struggling to make ends meet start to pull their resources together and argue that the government has not done well by them. But in a sign of the post-Reconstruction times, even the Farmers Alliance, which was formed of farmers across the country, is thoroughly segregated, where they have a white Farmers Alliance and then the colored Farmers Alliance, which has significant power in places including South Carolina. I mention this because the populists are starting to gain support and sympathy across the South after the so-called Mississippi Plan is put in place throughout the region, starting in 1875. Mississippi Plan, very simply, is a plan of attack against the Reconstruction governments, which was hatched first in Mississippi in 1875, where they used a combination of physical violence and restrictive voting laws to essentially neutralize the Black vote throughout the South. So you have to start Mississippi in 1875. You have the red shirts in the Carolinas. You have the white leagues in Louisiana. All across the South, you're seeing states where the Democratic Party is desperately trying to get back into power, utilizing versions of the so-called Mississippi Plan to push back against Black political power in the South and against the Republican Party throughout the South as well. And suffice to say, the plan works out quite well. But it doesn't just stop during Reconstruction. This plan goes deep into the 1890s which actually helps to explain the presence of folks like, of course, Ben Tillman. Now, Tillman, of course, had his claim to fame as being someone who was out there with the red shirts in 1876. When he campaigns for governor, he talks proudly of his time fighting alongside the red shirts, bringing redemption to South Carolina. But it's also worth pointing out that Ben Tillman also gained a good bit of political power by presenting himself as a friend of white farmers in South Carolina, of the white working class in the state. Think, for example, about his push for the creation of what is now known as Clemson University. Governor Tillman's argument was very simple, that the state needed an agricultural technical institute to rival others across the South, and he felt that that place should not be the University of South Carolina, which he saw as being nothing more than a liberal arts school for the elite of South Carolina. And so he proposed the idea of what would become known as Clemson University. At the same time, Tillman also found himself as part of an intra-party fight within the Democratic Party between populists like himself and the so-called Bourbon Democrats, who were small government, low-tax conservatives who belonged to the Democratic Party in the 1870s, 80s, and 1890s. Now, Tillman would eventually become governor of the state, and not before too long, senator from South Carolina as well. We'll talk about his time in the Senate a bit next week. But Tillman, in particular, is instrumental in pushing for a new state constitution. Now, remember I mentioned at the start of our class this evening that the various southern states had to re-enter the Union partly by writing new state constitutions. Now it's about 25, 30 years later, and they're considering new state constitutions, but for a particular purpose, to weaken Black political and civil rights as much as possible. And so at the Constitutional Convention of 1895, there are only a handful of Black delegates there, including Robert Smalls, including William J. Whipple. But they are a decided minority. Now, I'll talk about how they feel about this convention in a moment. But I want to talk about some of the provisions written into this Constitution. Now, a big thing I always ask my students is, well, why the 1890s? Why not do it sooner, or why not do it a bit later? Well, the very easy answer to this is, well, in the 1890s, Southerners were white Southerners in the Democratic Party were concerned not only with the residue of Black political power, but also the rise of the populists as well. And what's going on is that the populists are starting to gain votes across the South by building a biracial coalition. Folks like Tom Watson in Georgia and other places are really pushing for the idea that, yeah, sure, we're becoming more and more segregated, but at the same time, we can still vote together at the ballot box. And part of what this Constitution was designed to do was to weaken, if not outright destroy that idea. So with this new Constitution, you see things like a literacy test, which is designed to disenfranchise voters who can only read at a certain level. In some cases, even if they can read at that level, people giving the test can find ways to make sure they actually fail the exam. And another crippling blow to voting rights in the South is the poll tax, which becomes one of the chief things in the 20th century many activists fight against. The poll tax, I think, is a great example of how anti-Black racism in the South hurt everyone, not just Black people. Now, these various state conventions, starting with Mississippi in 1890, many of the delegates could not outright say, we are trying to write new state constitutions, specifically to disenfranchise Black voters. Now, I say that, but funny enough, there were statements from folks in Mississippi, in South Carolina, and elsewhere where they're saying, actually, that's exactly what we're trying to do, but we can't write that in our Constitution thanks to the 14th and 15th Amendments. So they have to find ways around that. One of them was the literacy test, the other one was the poll tax. Now, the poll tax, it's important to know how it actually works. Let's say you're a sharecropper. You're a person who has to work the land owned by someone else. You're having to pay off your debts from buying seed, buying tools, paying for your rent, the place you lived at, etc. You having to purchase everything from the store owned by the landowner. In essence, if you were a sharecropper, you were indebted to this person, oftentimes for life. Sharecropping emerges as the chief economic system in the South in the post-Reconstruction period. And many white and Black Southerners alike are forced to work as sharecroppers to make ends meet. Now, where does the poll tax come into this? The poll tax often had to be paid, like in South Carolina, for example, it had to be paid 6 months before the election. So let's say the election is November of that year. You're having to pay the poll tax in May of that year or June of that year. What that meant was that as soon as you make your money off of your crop for the growing season, you're having to decide, do I pay my poll tax now, or do I put food on the table for my family? Many poor whites and Blacks alike had to make that difficult choice during election season. And so across the South, during the Reconstruction period, you see record amounts of voter participation. But from the 1890s until the 1950s and 60s, the South is really the least democratic part of the country in terms of voter participation, in terms of the South becoming basically ruled by a one-party system in the Democrats generation after generation. And constitutions like those of South Carolina really showed how even white South Carolinians were severely hurt by post-Reconstruction policy. Now, here's some other provisions from that Constitution. Again, you have to pay a poll tax at least 6 months in advance. You have to own at least $300 worth of property. You have to pass a literacy test. And if you were convicted of the following crimes, you could not vote: bigamy, burglary, arson, robbery. Again, these things were targeted mainly towards Black Americans, but folks like Tillman had no qualms about stripping Black, or rather white South Carolinians the right to vote as well. But I think it's worth noting Black resistance even to this. This is actually from a speech that Robert Smalls gave in 1895 at the convention. Again, Smalls, at this point, he had served in Congress, he was a Civil War hero and so forth, but he had to make his presence felt at the convention as one of a handful of Black delegates. And he said in his speech the following, quote, "Since Reconstruction times, 53,000 Negroes have been killed in the South, and not more than 3 white have been convicted and hung for these crimes. I want you to be mindful of the fact that the good people of the North are watching this convention upon this subject. I hope we will make a constitution that will stand the test. I hope that we may be able to say when our work is done that we have made as good a constitution as the one we are doing away with." Unfortunately for Robert Smalls, that was not the case. The Constitution of 1895 would usher in a new age in South Carolina, the age of Jim Crow segregation. All right. Okay, so I see there are some questions in the chat.
Robert, let me make a point about that 1895 Constitution before we move on. Dealing with today's legislature and the reality of politics, the thing that bites me most on the place that needs to be bitten is the fact that what Tillman did, with the understanding that there were more Black voters at the time than there were white voters, and that the opportunity of losing control through the governor being elected as a Black person, the power of the 1895 Constitution devolved the power from the executive to the legislature, specifically to the Senate, which they continued to control. And so those movies and the TV shows you see about Boss Hogg, the one senator from the county that runs everything, that was true. And then in 1895, there weren't even 46 counties, but there was one senator that appointed literally the three men he could trust, and these were men, and they were white, to run elections. We still have legislative delegations appointing the election commission. So we've got over here is a Republican election commission, over here is a Democratic one. So that's an issue. There were no local governments then. There were no city councils, there were no county councils. The senator took care of all that. And it wasn't until the early 70s that Reynolds v. Sims started in the 60s, a question of equal rights voting under the 14th Amendment, one person, one vote. And that was clearly wasn't happening. And so it took from the early 60s until I think it was 72, Robert, correct me on the dates here, when Reynolds v. Sims was settled, that made South Carolina reorganize and let the cities and the counties actually elect their own people. And that was called the Home Rule Act. What we'll get into, we've got one of the main proponents and a guy that ran the Municipal Association for 35 years, Howard Duvall, that will be with us at a class down the road when we get up to that 1970s time. But the things that were planted in the 1895 Constitution, we are still suffering under now. And want you to hold that thought, and we'll explain it as we move through the eras here. Thank you, Dr. Greene.
No problem. So I'll go ahead and try to address these questions as much as possible. I see Christina had a question. When we think about the ways Reconstruction could have looked, are there any ways to predict what could have happened had Confederate military and political officers been tried for treason or faced some kind of consequence? It seems like one major mistake is that no one in the Confederacy was held accountable long-term for their actions. That's a good question. So I'll start with the question of, are there any ways to predict what's going to happen? It's difficult to say. I know looking back now, and I know I've had this same desire myself, that I wish that more Confederate soldiers had been tried for treason. But I think this is, again, going back to how many Northern politicians were desperate to move on from the war. And this is actually a hallmark of American history. Americans love to move on from disasters and tragedies as though nothing had actually happened. And in the Reconstruction period, I think it would have looked very different if, say, a Robert E. Lee had been tried for treason. Now, Jefferson Davis, he's actually put in prison for a while, but eventually he is released as well. And what's notable is even by the mid-1870s, within living memory of the Civil War, you're already beginning to hear Northerners say, oh, woe is the white South, they're suffering so much under Reconstruction, so on and so forth. And I think that would have been different had perhaps there been a bigger effort to actually prosecute Confederate leaders. Because again, you have some of these ex-Confederate leaders back in Congress. That's a very marked thing from being tried for treason. So I think it certainly would have changed things, but there were many white Northerners, even some Republicans, who just were not interested in going down that road, which I think was probably a major mistake on their part, as some of them began to realize in the late 1860s.
Dr. Greene, part of that was driven by the fact that Abraham Lincoln, as well as a lot of these Northern people, they were against slavery, but they weren't necessarily committed to doing away with white supremacy.
Not at all.
So Lincoln, I've read some stuff now that said that Lincoln didn't want to consider that the South had even the right to leave the Union. And so it wasn't a matter of bringing them back in, it was a matter of making them do the right thing. So there were all these nuances, but a lot of it had to do with just kind of an inherent racism that was across the board that was different from the people that were involved in the slavery in the South. Is that right, Dr. Greene?
Oh, very much so, yes. And I think also that points to, like you mentioned, this points to also why things like a much larger version of land redistribution didn't happen. That these questions that were raised by the Civil War, at the end of the war, for example, of, well, how did we help Black people get on their feet after the war? This was a big political question. And there were some radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens in Pennsylvania who were saying, we should give them land. We should redistribute land from the plantation elite to them. But most folks in Congress said that's a bad idea because they said, if we go down this road, we're going down the road of the redistribution of wealth. And that's a bridge too far for many of us. You know, that might be construed as being socialistic or communistic. And again, and this is the thing, right? I think some folks in the audience are probably laughing, but remember, Karl Marx is alive and writing at this time. People are already talking about socialism as a serious thing. As a matter of fact, during Reconstruction, and I think Daniel will especially be interested in this, during Reconstruction America, in Europe, you have the Paris Commune in 1871. And there are Americans who are saying, if we aren't careful with Reconstruction, we could have Paris communes all across the place here in the US if we allow the contagion of communism to attach to the contagion of Black freedom in the United States. So again, these questions of how socialism relates to Black history and the civil rights, these were not new in the 20th century. They have been around for a much longer time period than that. Okay, Dr. Goldman has a couple of questions in the chat. One is, would you speak to the Ellington Massacre and also speak on the relationship between Martin Delaney and Wade Hampton? All right, so Ellington Massacre, right? So I mentioned the Hamburg Massacre a moment ago. And before I get to this, I just want to say that one of the most difficult parts of teaching about Reconstruction is getting across just how violent the era was. And especially when you consider this is right after the bloodiest war in American history, the U.S. Civil War. Now, you saw Robert Smalls gave that number of 53,000 Negroes killed in the Reconstruction period and afterwards. And that number, I think there's been some debate and argument about it. But when you think about things like the Ellington Massacre, it doesn't sound so crazy. Now, the Ellington Massacre took place in September of 1876. So this is right around the time, this is just after the Hamburg Massacre. But Ellington, the reports are up to 100 Black people killed in and around the area. This was sparked primarily by the red shirts. In the area itself, it's sparked by a white woman accusing two Black men of trying to attack her. This turns into a posse of white men forming, but it's very much tied to the insurgency of red shirts across South Carolina in the 1876 campaign, who were fired up and ready to basically kill any Black person they see. Now, the Ellington Massacre, it doesn't help that you have white men coming in from Augusta, Georgia, from Columbia County, Georgia, crossing the border to stand side by side with white South Carolinians to kill Black men. They went out to the streets, into the fields in Ellington, South Carolina, which is right in Aiken County in that area, and just killed any Black men they saw. Again, the Reconstruction period is one that is filled with massacres all over the South. I mean, you have Colfax in Louisiana, you have the riots in Memphis and New Orleans, you have Hamburg, you have so many others. And then there are still many more Black men and women who quite simply disappeared dead of night, thanks to the Klan, thanks to the White Leagues, thanks to vigilante violence across the board. Okay, also speak on the relationship between Martin Delaney and Wade Hampton. Now, this is one of those questions that I think vexes a lot of people when they first hear it. So, as we discussed last week, Martin Delaney was a prominent abolitionist. He serves in the Union Army during the Civil War. After the war, Delaney is prominent in civil rights circles. But by the 1870s, he comes to South Carolina, becomes involved in the state's politics. And by 1876, Delaney actually backs Wade Hampton III for governor. Now, I think you're probably thinking, what in the hell was Martin Delaney thinking? This guy was one of the prominent Black nationalists of his era. He was a stalwart supporter of abolitionism, so on and so forth. But to Delaney, he probably saw Hampton as the best opportunity for Black people to get along and get by in South Carolina. Keep in mind that in 1876, Republican Party is bitterly divided. But not only that, what's important is that when Hampton runs for governor, even though he has the red shirts behind him, Hampton does also run a paternalistic campaign where he's saying to Black voters, recognizing how many there are, they can't all be suppressed at one time. He's saying to Black voters, if you vote for me, I'll make sure to treat you fairly. He makes allusions to the old master slave relationship before the Civil War. He's saying you can trust white South Carolinians to treat you well, to do right by you. Even though Black voters looking around saying, well, these are the same people who are trying to kill us right now, that's probably not true. Still, you have some Black South Carolinians like Delaney who decide to back Wade Hampton. They think that he's probably going to win anyway, so their best chance for peace after Hampton comes to office is to go ahead and support him now. There are some Black South Carolinians who play this dangerous game of trying to see which way the wind blows and saying, we're going to go in that direction. We're going to go ahead and support Wade Hampton. In the long run, of course, it doesn't really work out for them. All right. Okay. Baba Derek has a great question. Would you speak to the economy of South Carolina during Reconstruction? According to the Charleston Daily News, the state of South Carolina's economy did better under Black rule than before the war. And this is a big point. Even though the state was devastated by the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the Reconstruction governments are trying, for one, to diversify South Carolina's economy, to make it not so dependent on cotton and other cash crops as well. And so the economy does begin to do a bit better during Reconstruction. But this is actually why the Panic of 1873 is so bad, because when the panic hits and the state and the country are plunged into a depression, that hurts a good bit of their support in the state, because the economy does badly as a result, not of what the state government is doing, but because of events beyond their control. But yeah, the economy during Reconstruction is starting to recover after the Civil War, thanks in large part to Republican Party policies that are pursued by Black leaders in the state government. What is your opinion of John J. Jackson's Black Reconstruction in South Carolina? Now, that's a great question, and I would have an opinion if I'd actually had a chance to read it. It's been on my reading list for a long time. I've just not had a good chance to get to it. What I would say, though, is that I think I'm glad that book's out there, because we need a lot of additional books on the Palmetto State during Reconstruction. There are quite a few, but I think there's enough to write about the state during Reconstruction to say a lot more. In terms of the Rollins Sisters, in terms of the Constitutional Convention, in terms of the Land Commission. For example, the Land Commission I mentioned has only gotten one book that was written back in the late 60s and has gotten the master's thesis written at USC around 2009-10, and that's it. Also, David Blight's Race and Reunion. Race and Reunion is one of my favorite works. In fact, let me see. I used to have it. Oh, here it is. Oh, it's not. I used to have it here in my home office. I think it's in my office at Claflin. But Race and Reunion by David Blight is a great work. It's one of the works that really gets into Civil War memory and how Americans remember the Civil War after it was fought. And it has a lot of rich content, talks about in particular how Black Americans remember the Civil War. Now, I think this book is especially important because the last 10 years, or last 5 or 7 years, we've had a lot of debates about Confederate statues, memorials, and so forth. And I think before you make up your mind about those, you really should read Race and Reunion. You should read the works of Karen Cox. And in particular, you should come to next week's Modjeska session hosted by Jennifer Taylor. We'll talk more about it in the class tonight, which is all about Confederate memorialization. But again, David Blight's Race and Reunion is a great place to start. One of the things that he talks about very briefly is he makes an argument that there were 3 modes of remembering the Civil War. There was a reunion narrative. There was a war between the states. It was a tragedy, brother against brother. There's the lost cause narrative, that we all know so well, that the South said it was a lost cause, we were outnumbered, we were outgunned, it was a noble effort, but it ultimately failed. But the war wasn't about slavery, about states' rights. But there was a third view of Reconstruction, or rather of memory of the Civil War Reconstruction, and it was an emancipationist view. And that view was the Civil War was a good thing because it ended slavery, and the emancipationist view was held by former abolitionists, but it was especially held to by Black Americans in the country. This is by the way, I don't want to get rant about this, but this is why it kind of drives me nuts when pundits and commentators will say, well, we used to have this shared narrative of American history, and then it was shattered by critical race theory. That's not true. Black Americans, from the end of the Civil War onward, always taught their children and grandchildren that the war was about slavery. They always taught at Black-run elementary and high schools and at Black-run universities that when it came to American history, when it came to the Civil War, it was about slavery. It was about fighting white supremacy. And so even though most of white America in the 19th and 20th centuries held to either a lost cause view or reconciliationist or union, most Black Americans held to an emancipationist view that saw the war as a noble endeavor to end slavery. David Blight's Race and Union really gets into that. Okay. All right, next question from Dan. In Black Reconstruction in America, which I have right here, Du Bois referred to Reconstruction as the dictatorship of labor. There has been much debate around this designation. Do you understand the latter as analogous to the Paris Commune or a prefiguration to a workers' government? Okay, this is a really interesting question. So I think certainly Du Bois was partly trying to invoke the Paris Commune and invoke the ideas of radicalism in the 1860s and 70s. In fact, actually, David Roediger wrote a really good book about this era as well. It looks at it from that point of view, maybe which I'll find in a few minutes. But one thing about Du Bois is that if you ever read Black Reconstruction, one of the things that he really talks about is the relationship between race and labor in the South, not just during slavery, but during Reconstruction as well. And one of the things that Du Bois laments, going back to Brett's earlier question about thinking about a multiracial movement for democracy in America, Du Bois laments the fact that there was an opportunity during Reconstruction for a genuine unity of Black and white laborers, but it never comes to pass. And so Du Bois, he makes this case that what kills Reconstruction is not just the redemptionist regimes in the South. It's not just the white leagues and the red shirts. He also makes an argument that Reconstruction ending the way it did benefited Northern capitalists, because he said the capitalists in the North were interested in bringing the South into the national and international capitalist fold. They had no interest in spreading democracy, and especially no interest in a workers' or industrial democracy. And again, I think it's worth noting that Du Bois wrote this book in 1935 when there's a small thing called the Great Depression going on. And by that point, if you look at, for example, Du Bois' syllabi that he's teaching at Atlanta University, he's leading seminars on Marx and Marxism. And he's reading with his students theories of Marxism, communism, socialism. And one of the things that Du Bois takes away from that in his research for Black Reconstruction in America is this idea that for America to formally and forcefully deal with the issue of race and with the issue of class, the Black and white working class in the country are going to have to find a way to come together and create a genuine industrial democracy. And so when you think about Black Reconstruction in America, if any of you have a chance to sit down and read it, or if you've already read it, you want to keep that context in mind too. Although ironically enough, some of the harshest critics of Black Reconstruction were actually Black leftists who felt that Du Bois' Marxism didn't go far enough, or it was just half-baked. All right. Okay, I think Keith Whitaker has an interesting comment. History repeats itself like a consequence of accountability. I wonder what you're referring to there. Certainly, I think in the last 2 years or so, I'm sure. But she also points out, also, perhaps if we give, quote unquote, give free persons land, we might have to revisit giving it back to Native peoples we stole it from in the first place. Again, this is why Congress kind of shut down these debates. Is that they understood that if you start talking about the redistribution of land, you get into questions of redistribution of wealth, and then it becomes a question of who is it given to, what groups deserve it, and so forth. And again, you see these questions in the Reconstruction period. You'll see them again 100 years later, almost to the day, during Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign in 1968, where some of these same arguments about a slippery slope with the redistribution of wealth are raised time and time again. Okay. Donna Jones, what is your opinion of 40 Acres and a Mule by Aubrey? Now, again, I got to admit, I have not checked that one out yet, and I apologize. I just have not had a chance to read that one. But I will tell you this. That one is, that's a work that, again, gets a lot of attention, especially among folks in Black studies. But it's a really important work because it really puts into, I think, proper context what the Freedmen's Bureau is doing during Reconstruction, what Black families are doing during Reconstruction. And the one thing about that book is that, I was going to mention this earlier tonight, I'm glad you reminded me of it. When it comes to Reconstruction history, the two most prominent books are, of course, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, which was written in 1935, and then Eric Foner's Reconstruction, which was first published in 1987. This is the re-released version from 2014. Now, these are the two biggest books on Reconstruction. The latter one, the Foner book, does make some references to 40 Acres and a Mule by Claude Aubrey, mainly because, unlike most other Reconstruction histories, what links Du Bois and Foner together is that both of them take Black agency seriously. And so Foner cites Aubrey and other Black historians, other Black scholars on Reconstruction history, trying to do what many other Black historians had not done, which is to actually give Black people a voice during Reconstruction. Now, what you're going to see with Jen Taylor's presentation next week and in classes after that is that a lot of the history we're talking about in this class, especially the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, was seen in a specific interpretive lens, primarily by historians who were tied to what's known as the Dunning School of History. The Dunning School was formed by William Dunning at Columbia University in New York, and this was a school of thought prominent throughout the first half of the 20th century, which argued that Reconstruction was a failure, it was a mistake to give Black men the right to vote, and that redemption proved that white men were certainly capable of democracy, but Black men were not. Now, when Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction, his is one of the few books that's saying, actually, that's complete claptrap. That's just not correct. But Foner's book, written in the 80s, builds off a generation of scholars who read Du Bois in the 60s and 70s and said, actually, Du Bois has a good point here. And by the 60s, you're seeing Reconstruction historiography starting to dramatically change to where Black people are getting more voice, more agency, and especially thanks to the Civil Rights era, folks like C. Van Woodward and other historians were saying, John Hope Franklin, they're all saying, hey, you know, Reconstruction may not have been a mistake so much as they weren't allowed to succeed in the first place, right? But certainly, I think Claude Aubrey's book is one that has been referenced by a lot of historians since then, since it was first published in the late 1970s, as a way to give voice to Black people who were living and dying during the Reconstruction period. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Okay. So I see Chris has raised his hand. Go ahead, please.
You have two Chris's.
I think, well,
Okay.
I was the one that raised my hand.
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
The book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, was recommended by somebody, I don't remember who, but I've been listening to it on audiobooks, and there's a lot of references to Asians moving into Egypt that really affected the Black African experience in Egypt. And I was wondering if somebody could tell me what modern day countries would these Asians be coming from? Because Asia's big.
You know, I think that was actually recommended by Dr. Gallman. Dr. Gallman, if you want to go ahead and chime in, you're more than welcome to.
Sure. First, I think we need to understand that Chancellor Williams was a professor at Howard University, and he used an unorthodox method of getting his information. He literally traveled throughout Africa and talked to the elders and the scholars to get their history rather than to read what had been written by the colonizers. His own opinion was that in the later dynasties, after the so-called New Kingdom, in dynasties 21, 22, and 23, that people from some of the bordering areas, the Hittites, the Libyans, and many of whom were actually, they were called Asiatics, but many of them were Africoid, had moved in, and he called them, they produced what Dr. Williams, who was actually also from South Carolina, he was a native of Bennettsville, and John G. Jackson, who Baba Derek mentioned earlier, who's written quite a few very, very important books, is himself from Aiken. But John G. Jackson called them a race of mulattoes. And he said, huh?
The Libyans?
No, he said that that's what the Egyptian was becoming in those later dynasties.
So who did he call mulattoes? The Egyptians?
Yes, the Egyptians, because of the movement of the Hittites, the Assyrians, and those peoples into Egypt and intermarrying with the population.
So that would be modern day Syria and Iraq?
Yeah, yeah. Persia, which is Iraq. So
I thought Persians were Aryans.
I mean Iranians. Assyrians would be in that area. Now, what I think is important to point out is that the 25th dynasty, which ironically is the only dynasty that the old-time Egyptologists recognized as being led by Black rulers, was a dynasty from Nubia. And they were related to many of the earlier dynasties. And some of my teachers call that a form of a Reconstruction dynasty, where they brought back the original values and ethics and morals and philosophies of the earlier Kemetic dynasties, which had suffered under the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th dynasty. And so then they were eventually pushed out, I think, by the Assyrians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, then the Arabs, and then the Romans. It got to the point where Dr. John Henry Clark often said that the Egyptians got to a point where they didn't ask for freedom. They just asked to be dominated by somebody who was civilized. Because
Chris, your question has tapped the wellspring of Dr. Gallman's knowledge. And well, the good thing is what we're going to do is we haven't announced it yet, but Dr. Gallman's going to be doing another class that runs along parallel with this at his convenience, getting into this history that's so important and so critical. But we've got 9 minutes left, gentlemen. Let's see if there's some other questions.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dr.
No, I was also listening with the considerable interest as well. But that's actually an interesting segue to our next question from Greg Howell, who asked, I think, perhaps the most important question of the evening. Can you talk about what it was like to suddenly be free and having to relate to your former master as an equal? I'm actually going to answer this partly by putting in the chat a link to a primary source. This is a letter that was written by a man named Jordan Anderson, who had been enslaved and then received a request in 1865 from his former master to return to work for him. And spoiler alert, Jordan Anderson says, I'm not coming back because he doesn't have to. And he says, again, because the former master is trying to entice him back, partly by saying, hey, you know, your daughters are here in Tennessee, you should come back for them. At the end of this letter, Jordan Anderson says, in answering this letter, please state if there would be any sympathy for my Millie and Jane, who are now grown up and both good-looking girls. You know how it was with poor Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve and die if it came to that than have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. You will also please state if there has been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education and have them form virtuous habits. Now, what's, I think, important note about your question is that, again, for so many Black Americans, this was their first taste of freedom. It wasn't without uncertainty, though, as we saw with the Black Codes, as we saw with the Ku Klux Klan, as we saw with the end of Reconstruction. But in the 1860s and early 1870s, America arguably it's at its most democratic, at least up until the mid-20th century, because of this outburst of political, social, and cultural power from 4 million men, women, and children who had previously been enslaved in the South. Now, one thing that's going on, by the way, just to quickly answer your question, is that as soon as slavery is destroyed by the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, one of the first things many Black people in the South do is they try to piece their families back together. If you were to go and read a newspaper from the South in 1865 or 66, maybe in 1867, you will find advertisements where Black men are saying, can you help me find my wife? Can you help me find my brother? Can you help me find my daughter, my sister? Because all these folks have been sold away from each other before and during the Civil War. And so part of what you're seeing in Reconstruction is people are trying to say, how do I literally put my family back together? Or what Jordan Anderson is saying is, how do I give my children and my children's children a life better than the one I had as an enslaved person? But so certainly, to answer your question, what was it like? It was both euphoric and exhilarating on the one hand, and dangerous and challenging on the other. But it was damn sure better than what they were under slavery. All right. Okay, Robert Derrick sent me another question. He said, are you familiar with the work of Joel Williamson, After Slavery, Negro in South Carolina During Reconstruction? Williamson's book is a really important one. It's, I think, one of the great works on Black life in the Palmetto State. But again, I think even though Williamson's work is good, I think there's still room for another great history of Black America or Black South Carolinians during Reconstruction, because there's been so much work on Reconstruction done since then. I think there's a need for another great work on that. I think Williamson's book is good, but there's certainly space for plenty more. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and finish things up here. Again, this has been another great session of the Modjeska School this evening. I appreciate everyone's time and appreciate the wonderful questions as well. We're going to go ahead and finish up class with another short reading from Shannon to close us out this evening. And also, before we do that, I want to remind folks again that next week we'll be back with another Modjeska session, this time a guest session with Dr. Jennifer Taylor, who specializes in the history of Southern and Confederate monuments, memorialization. But her presentation is going to promise to link the red shirts of the Reconstruction period to the Proud Boys of today. And also, I must say, Jen Taylor is a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine at USC, we're both grad students, so you're in for a treat next week.